Here are 12 of the most iconic romance MCs, and starting off with Hachiman Hikigaya. If there was ever a protagonist who redefined romance anime, it was Hachiman. At first glance, he seems like your typical cynical loner. He mocks friendships, rolls his eyes at high school romance, and insists that youth is nothing more than people lying to themselves. But the more you watch Origaru, the more you realize Hachiman isn't cynical because he hates people, he's cynical because he understands them. Almost every conflict in the series comes from people hiding away what they truly feel. Nobody wants to disrupt the group, so they bottle up their emotions and pretend everything is fine. Hachiman sees through those lies immediately. The problem is his solution is usually another lie. Whenever someone asks the service club for help, Hachiman doesn't look for the perfect ending. Instead, he looks for the fastest way to end the conflict, even if it means making himself the villain. Hachiman will manipulate situations, he'll ruin his own reputation, he'll let everyone hate him even if it means someone else can move forward. That's why I call him the self-sacrificing liar. He lies to protect other people, but in doing so he convinces himself that his own happiness doesn't matter. That's the tragedy of Hachiman. He believes the only value he has is the pain he's willing to endure for others, which is why his famous desire for something genuine is so important. For the first time, Hachiman wanted relationships built on honesty instead of sacrifice. Not fake smiles, not convenient lies, just people accepting the other person for who they actually are. And that's why Hachiman remains one of the greatest romance protagonists ever written, because his story was never about finding love, it was about believing he deserved it. Sakuta Azusagawa. Some romance protagonists win people over with confidence, others with kindness. Sakuta does it through understanding. That's why I call him the Heart Whisperer. At first glance, Bunny Girl Senpai looks like a supernatural mystery. Girls disappear, memories are rewritten, and strange phenomena seem impossible to explain. But those supernatural events are really just metaphors for emotional struggles. Mei becomes invisible because she feels forgotten. Kaede loses herself after experiencing trauma. Every case is less about solving a mystery and more about understanding the person behind it. And that's exactly what Sakuta does. While everyone else searches for answers, Sakuta simply listens. He doesn't judge people for their insecurities or tell them how they really should feel. He stays by their side until they can face those feelings themselves. That honesty is what makes him such a refreshing protagonist. He never hides how he feels, and because of that, the people around him feel comfortable enough to open up to him as well. Sakuta doesn't just solve supernatural problems, he understands people's hearts, and that's why no title fits him better than the Heart Whisperer. Kazuya Kinoshita. If there was ever a romance protagonist who divided the anime community, it's Kazuya. Whether you love him or hate him, one title has followed him since the very beginning, and that is the ultimate simp. Kazuya is emotional, insecure, and constantly overthinks every interaction he has with Chizuru. He makes embarrassing decisions, lets his feelings get the better of him, and often creates problems that could have been avoided. That's exactly why so many people find him frustrating. Unlike killers like Sakuta, Kazuya isn't confident, he isn't naturally charismatic, and he certainly isn't perfect. He's simply a normal guy trying his best to be worthy of someone he deeply admires. That admiration that he has eventually becomes his greatest strength. When Chizuru dreams of becoming an actress, Kazuya doesn't just cheer from the sidelines, he helps fund and produce an entire independent film so she can fulfill her grandmother's wish. It's one of the biggest acts of devotion we've seen from a romance protagonist. The problem is that his kindness is often overshadowed by his lack of confidence. Kazuya spends so much time believing he isn't good enough that he struggles to see the person he's slowly becoming. That's why the ultimate simp fits him so well, because beneath all the awkwardness, embarrassment, and controversy is someone who loves with everything he has. And whether you think that's admirable or completely ridiculous, it's impossible to deny that no romance protagonist has earned that title quite like Kazuya has. Miyuki Shirogane. When people think of Miyuki, they usually think of a genius. He's the student council president, the top-ranked student at his academy, and the only person capable of matching Kaguya in their ridiculous game of psychological warfare. But here's the thing, Miyuki isn't naturally gifted, he's an overachiever. Unlike Kaguya, who grew up surrounded by wealth and privilege, Miyuki comes from a modest family. Every achievement he's earned is the result of relentless effort. He studies longer than everyone else, works part-time jobs to support his family, and constantly pushes himself because he believes hard work is the only thing separating him from everyone else. That mindset defines everything he does. The battle in Love is War isn't really about who confesses first. It's about two people who are terrified of appearing vulnerable. For Miyuki, losing isn't just embarrassing, it feels like proof that he has never been good enough to stand side by side to Kaguya in the first place. So instead of relying on talent, he relies on discipline. If he isn't the smartest, he'll study harder. If he isn't the strongest, he'll train longer. If he isn't naturally talented, he'll simply outwork everyone else around him. That's what makes Miyuki such an inspiring protagonist. His His success doesn't come from being born exceptional, it comes from refusing to settle for anything less than his best. And in the end, Kage doesn't fall in love with him because he's perfect. She falls in love with the determination behind every late night, every impossible challenge, and every ounce of effort he pours into becoming a better person. That's why no title fits Miyuki better than the underdog. Rentarou Aijou. Most romance protagonists struggle to make one girl happy. Rentarou somehow manages to make 100 happy. That's why I call him the perfect boyfriend. When you first see the premise of the 100 girls who really love you, it sounds completely absurd. Rentarou discovers that he's destined to have 100 soulmates, and if he fails to return to even one of their feelings, they'll die. It sounds like the setup for a generic harem comedy, but Rentarou is anything but a generic harem protagonist. Unlike so many romance leads who are indecisive or oblivious, Rentarou never takes anyone's feelings for granted. He gives every girlfriend his full attention, remembers the little things that matter to them, and constantly goes out of his way to make each of them feel loved. He doesn't play favorites, he doesn't avoid difficult conversations, and he never treats love like a game. That's what makes him so refreshing. Despite the ridiculous premise, Rentarou approaches every relationship with complete sincerity. Whether he's planning a heartfelt surprise or making an outrageous sacrifice for someone he cares about, his actions always come from a place of genuine love. It's easy to laugh at how over the top the series is, but beneath all the chaos is a protagonist who simply wants everyone around him to be happy. And in a genre full of hesitant, clueless, and indecisive main characters, that makes Rentarou stand out. Because if there's one romance protagonist who's earned the title of the perfect boyfriend, it would obviously be Rentarou Aijou. Ryuji Takasu. If there's one romance protagonist who constantly gets judged before he even says a word, it's Ryuji. At first glance, he looks like a textbook delinquent, sharp eyes, intimidating expression, and a reputation that makes people cross the street to avoid him. But in reality, he's basically the chillest person inside Toradora. That contrast is what really defines him. Ryuji is gentle, responsible, and almost absurdly good at taking care of people. He cooks, cleans, manages household chores, and takes care of his single mother like it's second nature. He's the kind of guy who knows the small details others miss, especially when it comes to people he cares about. But socially, he struggles. A single misunderstanding can completely flip how other people see him, and that constant gap between his appearance and personality becomes a running theme in his life. That's also where Taiga Isekai enters the picture. What starts as a chaotic arrangement quickly turns into something deeper. Ryuji becomes one of the few people who sees past Taiga's harsh exterior. Not because he's fearless, but because he's patient. He understands what it feels like to be misjudged. And in a way, that's what makes him so important as a romance protagonist. Ryuji isn't someone who wins people over with confidence or charm. He does it with consistency, with care, with effort that never really asks for recognition. He doesn't try to be a hero, he just tries to do what's right for the people around him, even when it's inconvenient, even when it goes unnoticed. That's why despite the misunderstandings, the rumors, and the intimidating first impression, Ryuji Takasu ends up being one of the most dependable hearts in romance anime, and maybe the most fitting title for him is simple, the gentle delinquent. Gojo Wakana. If there's a romance protagonist who proves that passion can be just as powerful as personality, it's Gojo. At first, Gojo is someone who keeps to himself. He's quiet, reserved, and carries the weight of a childhood insecurity that made him hide what he loves most, his craft. But everything changes when Marine enters his life. Unlike most people, she doesn't see his interests as strange or embarrassing. She sees value in them. And for the first time, Gojo's talent isn't something that he has to hide. It's something he can actually share. What makes Gojo stand out isn't loud confidence or bold declarations. It's precision, it's dedication. It's the way he can turn fabric measurements and hours of work into something that feels alive. Cosplay becomes more than just clothing for him, it becomes expression, and through Marine's encouragement, he slowly starts to believe that what he creates actually matters, because Gojo's growth isn't instant. He still doubts himself, he still hesitates, he still worries that he's not good enough to stand side by side with someone like Marine, and that's what makes this journey so meaningful, because every outfit he finishes, every skill he improves, every small step forward is proof that his passion has value. He doesn't become confident overnight, he becomes consistent. And that consistency turns him into something more than just a craftsman. It makes him someone who can create confidence in others through his work. That's why in a romance anime full of expressive personalities and loud emotions, Gojo stands out by doing the opposite. He lets his craft speak for him, and that's why no title fits him better than the master craftsman. Tomoya Okazaki. If there is ever a romance protagonist defined by change, it's Tomoya, but not the kind of change that happens quickly, and definitely not the kind that feels easy. At the beginning of Clannad, Tomoya is definitely someone who feels stuck in life. He skips class, drifts through days without direction, and keeps everyone at a distance, including himself. He's not cruel, but he's disconnected, like he doesn't really believe things can get better. But that starts to shift when he meets Nagisa Furukawa. At first, he helps her almost reluctantly, just another obligation in life that already feels empty. But over time, something changes. He starts showing up more, caring more, living less like he's just passing time, and more like he actually has a place in the world. But Tomoya's real story isn't just about falling in love, it's about falling apart and rebuilding. Because even after things seem to finally go right, life hits him harder than he ever expected. And in those moments, Tomoya doesn't magically become strong. He breaks, he struggles, he disappears into grief and distance again, but Clannad doesn't leave him there, and neither does he. Slowly, painfully, he comes back, not as the same person, but as someone who understands what it means to keep going, even when everything inside him says not to. That's what makes this journey so powerful. Tomoya doesn't become a hero through strength, he becomes one through endurance, through choosing to care again after loss, through choosing to stay when leaving would be easier. And that's why in a story full of emotional highs and devastating lows, Tomoya stands as something rare, a man who doesn't just grow up, he redeems himself. And that's why no title fits him better than the redeemed. Kyotaro Ichikawa. If there's a romance protagonist who proves that love doesn't require confidence, popularity, or even words, it's Kyotaro. At first glance, he seems like the definition of an introvert taken to the extreme. Quiet, awkward, constantly lost in his own thoughts, someone who prefers observing the world rather than being part of it, and in his own mind, that world is often a little darker than it really is. Kyotaro starts off as a boy who isolates himself emotionally, not because he hates people, but because he struggles to understand how he fits into them. He overthinks interactions, imagines scenarios, and builds distance where there doesn't need to be any, especially when it comes to Anna Yamada. At first, she feels like someone completely out of his world. Popular, bright, confident, the kind of person who exists on a completely different level socially. And Kyotaro convinces himself that someone like him can never really connect with someone like her. That's where the story quietly changes direction, because Anna doesn't treat him like he's invisible. She notices him, she talks to him, and slowly, without forcing anything, she pulls him into a world he never thought he belonged in. What makes Kyotaro so compelling is that he isn't suddenly becoming outgoing. It's that he doesn't ever become outgoing. He's still awkward, still shy, still stuck in his head most of the time, but he starts to show up anyway. He starts to care in small, consistent ways, not through real grand gestures or confident declarations, but through quiet actions that slowly build something real. And that's why no title fits him better than the introvert. Nasa Yuzaki. If there's a romance protagonist who skips the will they won't they phase entirely, it's Nasa. Because from the very beginning, he already knows what he wants. He wants to be a husband. Not someday, not eventually, right away. Nasa's life changes the moment he meets Tsukasa Tsukuyomi, because on the spot, he decides to confess his feelings and commit himself completely to someone he barely knows. And somehow, she says yes. That's where his story really begins. Unlike most romance protagonists who spend entire arcs struggling to understand love, Nasa's approaches it with an almost unusual level of clarity. He doesn't treat relationships like a game or a mystery to solve, he treats them like a promise. But that doesn't mean he's perfect. Nasa is still awkward, still inexperienced, still figuring out how marriage actually works in practice. Living with someone you love sounds simple in theory, but for him, it becomes a daily lesson in patience, communication, and understanding. What makes him stand out is how seriously he takes all of it. Even small gestures matter to him. Every misunderstanding becomes something he wants to fix. Every day with Tsukasa is something he actively tries to make better than the last. And beneath all the comedy, the confusion, and the unconventional pacing of his relationship, there's something genuinely sincere about him. Because Nasa doesn't chase romance, he commits to it. Fully, completely, without hesitation. That's why in a genre full of hesitant lovers and slow confessions, Nasa feels different. And that's why no title fits him better than the husband. Koyomi Araragi. If there's a romance protagonist who exists at the center of chaos rather than comfort, it's Koyomi Araragi. Because the story doesn't start with a normal love life, it starts with survival. After becoming a vampire and barely returning to human life, Araragi finds himself pulled into a world of apparitions, curses, and psychological distortions that most people will never even realize exist. And somehow he becomes the person who steps into all of it anyway. Not because he's the strongest, but because he can't walk away. What defines Araragi isn't just relationships, it's his responsibility. And that's where his role in the story shifts. Because Monogatari isn't just about supernatural encounters, it's about emotional wounds given form. And Araragi becomes the bridge between those wounds and the people carrying them. He doesn't fix everyone, he listens, he confronts, he endures. But he also pays the price for it. Every time he tries to save someone, he gets pulled further into his own contradictions. between self-sacrifice and selfishness, between wanting to help and not knowing when to stop. That tension is what makes him so compelling. Araragi isn't a perfect hero, he's a flawed one who keeps choosing to step in anyway, even when it hurts him, even when making things worse, even when he doesn't fully understand what saving someone really means. And that's why in a story built on psychological battles and emotional fractures, Araragi stands as one who keeps reaching out anyway. And that's why no title fits him better than the savior. Yuuta Togashi. If there's a romance protagonist defined by imagination over reality, it's Yuuta. Because before he's anything else, he's someone who used to believe in a different world. As the Dark Flame Master, Yuuta once lived fully inside his own fantasies, casting himself as the hero of an invisible story only he could see. It wasn't just a phase for him, it was a way of escaping a reality that felt too ordinary, too embarrassing, too uncomfortable to accept. But growing up doesn't mean just leaving fantasy behind, it means learning how to live with it. When Yuuta enters high school, he tried to bury that past completely. He wants to be normal again. But then he meets Rika, and suddenly the part of him he tried to erase comes back into the story. Because Rika isn't normal either. She still lives partially inside a fantasy world of her own, one filled with delusions, alternate realities, and meaning layered over everyday life. And instead of rejecting her, Yuuta finds himself doing something unexpected. He understands her. What makes Yuuta compelling is that he's stuck between two identities, the person he used to be and the person he's trying to become, and neither one fully disappears. And in that contradiction, he becomes something rare in romance storytelling, not someone who outgrows fantasy, but someone who learns how to balance it with reality. Because for Yuuta, love isn't about escaping imagination, it's about sharing it with someone who sees the world the same way. That's why in a story built on delusions and identity and growing up, Yuuta stands at the center of it all, not as a hero, not as a genius, but as someone who never fully stopped dreaming, and that's why no title fits him better than the dreamer. Anyway, I think these are 12 anime characters that make romance anime work. None of these characters are perfect, but I think that's the point. Some overthink, some overachieve, and some dream, some struggle to even understand themselves. But they all keep trying to love in their own way, and whether it's messy, awkward, or completely unconventional, it still feels real. Because in the end, romance isn't about being perfect, it's about becoming someone who tries.